There is a kind of silence that only appears after the story is finished. Not the silence of defeat, not the silence of exile, but the silence that comes when a life has already fulfilled its purpose and must continue anyway. Most people imagine grief as an explosion, a collapse, a visible breaking. But for some, grief is quieter. It arrives as routine, as obligation, as days that keep moving forward long after meaning has stopped moving with them. This is where this story begins. Not at a wedding, not at a coronation, not even at a tragedy, but on the morning after. In September of 1982, Prince Rainier III of Monaco did not disappear from public life. He did not abdicate. He did not withdraw. He did not collapse. Instead, he returned to work. Meetings resumed. Schedules were honored. State papers were signed. From the outside, nothing had broken. But inside the palace, something fundamental had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. Rainier had lost his wife. But more than that, he had lost the future he had already completed. Everything that had once pointed forward, the dynasty secured, the principality stabilized, the transformation achieved, had already been accomplished with her. What remained was not ambition. What remained was time. For 33 years, Rainier had ruled with urgency. There had always been something at stake: sovereignty, succession, survival. His life had been structured around necessity. But after 1982, necessity quietly vanished. Monaco was secure. The heir existed. The international recognition had arrived. The work continued, but the pressure that once justified it was gone. And that created a problem no treaty or economic plan could solve. What does a man do when duty no longer demands everything he has, but still demands that he show up? Those who worked closely with him noticed small changes, not breakdowns, not confessions, pauses. Rainier would stop mid-conversation, as if listening for something that wasn't there. His private apartments grew quieter. Music played less often. Hobbies faded without ceremony. He kept his routines, not because they brought comfort, but because they provided structure to endure the hours. Each day was filled. Each year passed. And yet, nothing was being built anymore. Loneliness is often misunderstood. It is not simply the absence of people. Rainier was surrounded by aides, by officials, by citizens who admired him deeply. His loneliness came from something else. He had already lived the life that gave his existence coherence. What followed was not failure. It was aftermath. The long period after the applause stops, when the audience leaves, the lights go out, and the stage remains. Waiting does not always look like despair. Sometimes it looks like discipline. Rainier continued to govern. He continued to expand Monaco. He continued to attend ceremonies, funerals, festivals. But beneath the surface, time was no longer a resource to be used. It was something to be passed through, not resisted, not embraced, endured. For the next 23 years, Prince Rainier would do what he had always done. He would fulfill his role. But the question this story asks is not how he survived. It is something quieter. What happens to a man when life asks him to keep going, after everything that gave going meaning has already ended? Duty is supposed to give life meaning. But sometimes, duty survives longer than purpose, and what remains is not direction, but momentum. Rainier did not ask whether he wanted to continue ruling. The question was never presented. The principality needed him. The state required continuity. The role did not pause for grief, and so he stayed. In the years following 1982, Rainier became more efficient. Not more inspired, not more visionary, more precise. Decisions were made quickly. Meetings shortened. Public appearances reduced to what was strictly necessary. There was no chaos, no decline in governance. If anything, Monaco functioned better than ever. From the outside, it looked like strength. From the inside, it was something else. It was control replacing connection. Control is often mistaken for confidence. But control can also be a way to survive when emotion becomes dangerous. Rainier had spent decades building systems, economic frameworks, political safeguards, legal protections. After Grace's death, those systems became his shelter. They did not ask him how he felt. They did not remind him of what was gone. They simply required compliance. And compliance is easier than grief. This is the quiet irony of Rainier's later reign. The more successful Monaco became, the less necessary he felt as a person. The state no longer depended on improvisation or vision. It ran on momentum. Growth continued. Land reclaimed revenues increased. International status secured. Each achievement confirmed the same truth. Everything important had already been solved. What remained was maintenance. Rainier did not slow down because he was ambitious. He worked because stopping would have exposed the emptiness underneath. Work filled the hours. Ceremony filled the calendar. Responsibility filled the silence. But none of it pointed toward a future he personally inhabited. His children were grown. Their lives were unfolding elsewhere. The dynasty would continue, with or without his emotional presence. He had become a steward of something already finished. Those closest to him noticed changes that were difficult to name. Not sadness, not depression, a thinning. Joy did not disappear dramatically, it receded quietly. Laughter became rarer. Curiosity narrowed. Pleasures that once energized him lost their gravity. This was not collapse. It was erosion. The kind that happens when time passes without renewal. Rainier's life entered a holding pattern. Each year resembled the last. Each appearance followed protocol. Each decision fit within an established framework. Nothing was wrong. That was the problem. When nothing is wrong, there is no reason to change. And when there is no reason to change, waiting becomes permanent. Endurance is often praised, but endurance without anticipation is not strength. It is stasis. Rainier endured not because he believed something better was coming, but because stopping would have required him to ask a question he did not want to answer. What is a life after its central relationship is gone and its primary mission completed? For years, Rainier continued to rule as Monaco flourished. The principality expanded. The wealth accumulated. The reputation solidified. Yet privately, his world was shrinking. And the question this part leaves hanging is simple. When duty no longer leads anywhere, does it still give life meaning? Or does it merely delay the moment when one must finally stop waiting? Loss does not end a family. It changes its geometry. People remain connected, but no longer move in the same direction. After 1982, Rainier did not lose his children. He lost the shape of the family they had been. When Grace was alive, the family revolved around a shared center. She was not only a mother, she was a stabilizing force. She created rhythm between public duty and private life, between expectation and warmth, between structure and affection. After her death, that center vanished. What remained was a set of individuals, each carrying grief in different ways, each moving forward at a different speed. Rainier stayed where he was. His children did not. Grief does not age equally. For Rainier, loss meant subtraction. For his children, it meant disruption. They were young enough that their futures were still open, but old enough to remember exactly what had been taken. Rainier responded by tightening his grip on continuity. The children responded by testing distance, not as rebellion, as survival. As the years passed, Rainier became a witness rather than a participant. He watched marriages form and dissolve, careers unfold unpredictably, public scrutiny intensify. Each child found their own way to live with absence, and each way moved further from him. Not emotionally hostile, simply elsewhere. The family gatherings continued. Photographs were taken. Ceremonies observed. But something subtle had changed. The conversations were shorter. The silences longer. Rainier did not intervene. He had already learned that intervention cannot restore what time has altered. As a ruler, Rainier understood succession. As a father, he struggled with it. He worried, quietly, about continuity, not just of the throne, but of coherence. Without Grace, he lacked the intermediary who once softened authority into reassurance. His children did not fear him, but they no longer leaned toward him either. They were growing into lives shaped by experiences he could not share. And Rainier, who had once built the future of a state, found himself unable to shape the emotional future of his own family. The arrival of grandchildren brought moments of light. Children have a way of briefly interrupting waiting. But even here, the pattern remained. The visits were scheduled. The joy was real, but contained. Rainier smiled. He held them. He watched them grow. And then they left. What returned afterward was quiet. Not painful. Familiar. Somewhere in these years, Rainier seems to have understood something fundamental. The family he had built with Grace belonged to a completed chapter. The relationships continued, but the structure that once gave them unity was gone. No decision could restore it. No effort could reverse it. This was not failure. It was reality. Families do not freeze in their most perfect form. They move on, sometimes leaving someone behind. With his children living independent lives, Rainier's waiting changed character. It was no longer only historical or institutional. It became personal. The palace grew quieter, not because it was empty, but because no one was returning to it in the same way. Meals became solitary, evenings extended, time stretched. Rainier had secured the future of his dynasty. He had watched his children build lives of their own. By every external measure, his personal obligations were fulfilled. And yet, something remained unresolved. If family no longer anchors you, and duty no longer drives you forward, what keeps a person present in their own life? The body is often slower than the mind. It keeps going long after belief has thinned, long after desire has faded, long after the future has stopped calling. But eventually, the body learns what the mind has already accepted, that the waiting cannot last forever. Rainier's decline was not sudden. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment when age overtook him. Instead, there was accumulation. Years of cigarettes, years of tension, years of living in a state of emotional suspension. His body had carried him through war, crisis, transformation, grief. Now it began to speak back, quietly at first. Shortness of breath, fatigue that no rest seemed to cure, infections that returned more quickly each time. These were not alarms. They were confirmations. It is tempting to frame illness as consequence, but this story is not about punishment. It is about alignment. The life Rainier had been living, a life of continuation without anticipation, no longer required a strong body. There was no new summit to climb, no new future to defend. The body began to loosen its grip because the reason to hold on had diminished. The hospital stays increased. Each admission followed the same pattern: concern, reassurance, temporary recovery. But each discharge brought him back to the same environment, the same palace, the same routines, the same quiet. Recovery did not mean renewal. It meant return. And return, by now, had become circular. Photographs from these years tell a restrained story. The posture slightly stooped, the movements slower, the eyes carrying something heavier than age. Not despair. Wear. The kind that comes from finishing everything you set out to do, and discovering that finishing does not bring release. Rainier continued to appear in public. He shook hands. He attended ceremonies. He fulfilled every expectation. But presence is not the same as participation. He was there. He was no longer fully in it. When he appeared publicly for the final time, the reaction was immediate. People stood. They applauded. Some wept. They were thanking him. But perhaps they were also saying goodbye, not only to a ruler, but to a chapter of themselves. Rainier accepted the applause with restraint. No speech, no flourish, just acknowledgement, as if he understood that nothing more needed to be said. As the hospitalizations grew longer, the waiting shifted again. It was no longer about time passing. It was about the body deciding. There were fewer plans, fewer expectations. The future narrowed to hours, then days. Rainier did not resist. Resistance requires hope. He had already done what he came to do. Acceptance does not always arrive with peace. Sometimes it arrives with fatigue, a deep cellular understanding that effort is no longer required. Those closest to him sensed it. The urgency vanished. The anxiety receded. What remained was stillness. By the early 2000s, Rainier had outlived his defining roles. Husband, builder, architect of Monaco's modern identity. The body was catching up to that truth. And the final question of this part lingers quietly. When the body begins to let go, is it surrender? Or is it simply recognition that the waiting has finally reached its end? Waiting does not end with a decision. It ends when the body no longer needs instruction to continue. By the final weeks of his life, Prince Rainier III was no longer holding anything together. Things were already complete. In March 2005, Rainier entered the hospital once more. This time there was no rhythm to the updates, no reassuring language, no careful optimism. His body was failing on multiple fronts. Lungs weakened beyond recovery, heart struggling to maintain pace, systems no longer cooperating. The language of medicine grew quieter, not dramatic, definitive. Rainier was no longer fighting, and no one was asking him to. One of the final formal acts of his life was procedural. Power was transferred, duties reassigned, continuity preserved. This mattered deeply to him, not as a ruler clinging to authority, but as someone ensuring that nothing would be left unresolved. He had always understood leadership as preparation for absence. Now, absence was approaching, and he prepared for it with the same restraint he had shown in life. Those close to him did not describe panic. They described calm. Not serenity, but relief. The relief that comes when effort is no longer required, when responsibility loosens its grip, when waiting no longer demands endurance. Rainier had carried his life with discipline. He would leave it the same way. When the end came, it was quiet. No spectacle, no final declaration. A son at his side, a moment of contact, then stillness. Europe's longest-serving monarch died not as a symbol, but as a man whose obligations were finally complete. The waiting ended not with drama, but with permission. The principality mourned. Ceremonies were held. Rituals observed. Music played. Monaco paused. But the mourning was not only for a ruler. It was for a kind of endurance that few could imagine sustaining. 56 years of leadership. 23 years of private absence. A life defined not by what was taken, but by what was carried afterward. When Rainier was laid to rest beside Grace, the symbolism was obvious. But this story does not end in romance. It ends in resolution. Not because love conquered death, but because waiting no longer separated them. The empty space was filled, not triumphantly, quietly, as it had always been. Prince Rainier III is often remembered for transformation, for building Monaco into something enduring. But his most demanding work came after that transformation was finished. It was the work of continuing without forward motion, of fulfilling duty without anticipation, of living after meaning had already been assigned. Most lives are measured by what they achieve. Few are measured by what they endure after achievement is complete. This is not a fairy tale. It is something more difficult to face. A reminder that sometimes the hardest years are not those of struggle, but those of waiting. And that survival, when stripped of hope and direction, is not a reward. It is simply time. Until time no longer asks you to continue.